Are we live?
Yes, so the webinar has started. And our attendees are coming in. There they are.
Tell me when to start.
So I would say let's give it maybe a minute or two so that a lot of people can join.
Okay.
We are live.
Okay.
Oh.
Should I start? Okay, Ali, I'm starting.
Yes, good.
So, hello, everyone. Those who are joining us from the United States, and those who are joining us from Greece, and those who are joining us from other countries. My name is Nicholas Prevelakis. I'm teaching political theory and also member of the Center for Hellenic Studies. That's organizing this event together with the Embassy of Greece in Washington. It is a great honor to be introducing this panel on the book, The Greek Revolution, a Critical Dictionary, edited by Professors Paschalis, Kitromilides, and Constantinos Tsoukalas, and published by Harvard University Press this year on the very anniversary of the 200 years since the Greek Revolution. It is a monumental work encompassing many aspects related to this event that we call the Greek Revolution, and I hope we'll say more about that term, from events to people, to sociological analysis, to controversial topics that we've been debating for years. Without further ado, and before I introduce the topic and the panelists, I would like to thank Ambassador Alexandra Papadopoulou for being with us today and asking her to give a welcome address.
Thank you, Mr. Prevelakis. All of us at the Embassy of Greece in Washington are delighted to be co-sponsoring tonight's event with Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. As you all know, this year marks the 200th anniversary of the Greek Revolution, an event of tremendous significance for Greece and for the world, and a milestone in humanity's struggle for freedom. I'm personally very happy to be joining such a select group of scholars who will discuss the many aspects of the Greek War of Independence covered in the Greek Revolution, a Critical Dictionary. Published by Harvard University Press this year, this book is the culmination of the unique collaboration of 21 prominent scholars who have spent considerable time and effort researching, studying, and analyzing this definitive event of modern Greek history and its global legacy. Edited by Professors Paschalis, Kitromilides, and Constantinos Tsoukalas, the book is the first of its kind. It demonstrates the importance of the Greek War of Independence to international history, having inspired many in Europe and South America. I'm also certain that the book will serve as a reference and inspire future historians as it brings together scholarship from many disciplines, covering topics, some of which are more and some are less well known. These include American Philhellenism, a phenomenon of great importance, not only for Greece, but also for the history of the United States, in that it did not only raise awareness about the Greek cause, but also brought attention to domestic American issues such as slavery and women's rights. The book also shows the abandonedness of revolutionary ideas in the tradition of the Enlightenment. I noticed that today's audience consists of people from the US, of course, but also from other countries around the world, including Greece. And I hope that the Greek public will soon have the opportunity to read the book in Greece. Finally, this body of work provides a great foundation for thinking about and discussing the Greek Revolution, while the list of speakers today are great ambassadors for this topic. Thank you again, and I wish you all the best in your proceedings.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Papadopoulou, for these remarks, and to the embassy, of course, for partnering with us and co-sponsoring this event. I would like to give the floor now to Professor Mark Shevsky, who's professor of the classics at Harvard University and director of the Center for Hellenic Studies, a historian of philosophy and science in the ancient world, but also with a great interest in the history of thought, including the history of modern Greece.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Ambassador Papadopoulou. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone on behalf of Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies. We're delighted to co-sponsor this event today. Our center is, of course, concerned not just with the world of the ancient Greeks on its own terms, but we also engage with the impact of ancient texts and ideas on the modern world. And so as a crucial formative event in the history of Hellenism, the Greek Revolution is a topic of the first importance to our center's agenda. So it's a great pleasure again to be able to discuss that set of events, the Greek Revolution, with such a distinguished panel marking the occasion of the publication of this marvelous book. Even a brief perusal of the book, I think, shows that the Greek Revolution looks both back to antiquity and forward to the challenges of today, as the ambassador has already indicated. It is, in fact, a compelling example of the power of texts and ideas from ancient Greece to influence historical events, in ways that are still felt in the modern world and resonate with many contemporary challenges, such as migration, the unity of Europe, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I would like to pass things back to Nicholas and ask him to introduce our distinguished panelists so that we can get to business. I look forward very much to their contributions and to the discussion amongst them and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, a few rules before we start. If at any moment you have any question, please put it in the Q&A right now. You don't have to wait till we open the discussion. That would also help us. What we will have is three parts. The first part is we are going to ask two of the contributors of the book to present the book, and then we'll have the panel with three discussants of the book. Now, and after that, we'll open the floor to discussions. First, I would like to welcome Paschalis Kitromilides, who is one of the co-editors of the book, who has been professor of political science at the University of Athens for many years, director of the Institute for Neo-Hellenic Research, National Hellenic Research Foundation, and the author of innumerable books on the Enlightenment, orthodoxy in the West, the idea of an Orthodox Commonwealth that we discuss a lot, Greek nationalism, and Enlightenment and religion in the Orthodox world, and many, many, many articles, some of which are, how should I say, great help to all of us who teach modern Greece and modern Greek nationalism to students who are interested in Greece, but who may be interested in social sciences at large. And with Professor Kitromilides is Ellen Angelomatis Tsoukarakis, who is one of the contributors of the book, in particular wrote the chapter on women, a very important chapter, Professor Emerita of the Ionian University, and who has published extensively on various aspects of Greek history from the 15th to the 19th century, covering social history, history of intellectual life and education, church history, landscape history, travel, literature, and of course, women. Let me give the floor to Professors Kitromilides and Professor Tsoukarakis, and then we'll move to the panel.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. Good evening to all, to fellow panelists and our audience around the world. On behalf of Constantinos, Tsoukalas, and myself, all I want to do is to just thank the Center for Hellenic Studies for marking the appearance of the critical dictionary with today's panel discussion. Our thanks go, of course, to Professor Mark Shevsky for hosting the event, and to Nicholas Prevelakis for shouldering the burden of organizing the meeting by combining the schedules of so many very busy persons. Quite an achievement, I would say. And of course, deep appreciation to Ambassador Alexandra Papadopoulou for honoring us with her presence and opening remarks tonight. I confess, I'm so keen to hear my fellow panelists this evening that I feel I should limit myself to just a few words of thanks to each one of them, especially to say how much I feel I owe to each one, in particular for their work, which has been a source of great inspiration for what I have tried to do. To Eleni Angelomati Tsugaraki, a distinguished historian of the period, which is covered by the critical dictionary, I feel indebted in more ways than I can really acknowledge, because she has stood by me in every possible manner in the production of the dictionary with her advice and her support at critical and difficult moments. And of course, I'm grateful because she has enriched the contents of the dictionary with two of the most important essays in the collection. To Joanna Haenni, I'm also very grateful for taking the time to share with us her impressions of the critical dictionary as a scholar of literature. And of course, I should not fail to mention that her recent translations of the works of a little known Greek prose writer, little known outside Greece, Andreas Karkavitsas, who is in his social and cultural criticism a Greek version of Émile Zola in many ways. She's making accessible to international readership the tradition of social criticism that really emanated from what was discussed and debated during the Greek Revolution and the Enlightenment period before it. To David Armitage, who knows the story of the critical dictionary from its very inception, I want to say thank you for the inexhaustible inspiration you have provided with your works on the age of revolution and your support throughout and advice throughout the work I had to shoulder on the critical dictionary, and very good and useful suggestions in developing the whole structure of the work. To Mark Mazower, whom I have known for many years, I want to say thank you for your great contribution to the history of modern Greece and for turning your critical thinking to the study of the Greek Revolution most recently. And I am delighted that at least through your participation in this panel tonight, I finally have you associated with the critical dictionary. Finally, I want to say a very sincere word of thanks to Harvard University Press and my editor, Kathleen McDermott. I hope she's in the participants tonight for invaluable guidance and advice throughout the production of the work. So this is my contribution to the panel tonight. But let me conclude with just two more words about the work itself and its purpose. This project, perhaps some of you are aware of it, has been on my mind since 1989 in my participation in the bicentennial, in the academic events of the bicentennial of the French Revolution in a memorable summer in Paris that year. At the time, I became aware of the Dictionnaire critique de la Révolution française, which had been published just a year before, 1988, and appeared in an English language translation by from Harvard University Press the following year. I always thought that a similar work could provide the necessary research aid for the establishment of the Greek Revolution in its appropriate place in the historiography of the Age of Revolutions. And this thought has remained with me since 1989, and I'm very grateful that finally that aspiration has materialized. I'm very grateful to Constantinos Tsoukalas for sharing this vision and for his support throughout the gestation and production of the project. And of course, I'm grateful to my fellow 39 co-authors who have produced the 46 essays of the book for helping in realizing this aspiration. And I must say that all of them have worked with great diligence and authority in producing the essays that make up the collection and in handling with great skill the subjects which we had asked them to cover. My hope is that the critical dictionary will represent a step in the direction of what I have been striving for throughout my career, what I have been calling the canonization of Greece, meaning the establishment of the study of modern Greece, not as a saint canonization, but as a recognizable subject in international scholarship, in its own right, a worthy partner to the study of the classical world. For all these reasons, in managing to realize the aspiration to produce the critical dictionary of the Greek Revolution, I'm very grateful. And I'm grateful to all of you for bringing your expertise to the consideration of the critical dictionary tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kitromilides, and now Professor Angelomati-Tsoukarakis, the floor is yours to say a few words about the book and its purpose.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm sorry I'm a bit, perhaps not properly speaking, but I'm sure you understand me. I was a bit embarrassed by all these good words by Professor Kitromilides, a good friend for many years. And I have to say that I share, and I shared in the past, his aspiration to produce this book, which as I will try to present to you, and I hope you'll excuse my bit extreme beginning. Well, I will start with a claim that might seem extreme to some of you, but I do think that the critical dictionary of the Greek Revolution will eventually become a reference book for the Greek Revolution, since its significance will become obvious both to historians and the general public. Its inclusion in the prestigious series of the Belknap Press of the Harvard University Press shows that its importance has already been recognized by experts. In any case, this volume will help to make this very important event of the early 19th century better known and understood, because the Greek Revolution has not been much studied outside Greece. Its importance for the rest of Europe, the United States of America, the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire has not been appreciated either by most non-Greek historians. The critical dictionary of the Greek Revolution was planned carefully by its editors in order to address most of its various facets of the revolution in its 7 thematic sections, which include 46 chapters in all. In the stimulating introduction by Professor Kitromilides, the revolution is properly set in its right place within the age of the revolutions, in which it is not often included. Professor Kitromilides also discusses 4 aspects of the Greek Revolution, which are seldom examined in recent times, despite their importance. The controversial issue of the date in which the War of Independence actually started, the efforts of the preservation of antiquities, the acute refugee problem, and finally, the important role of Ioannis Kapodistrias in the foundation of the modern Greek state. In the first section of the book, 2 chapters provide the necessary Balkan background of the revolution. The Balkan countries being connected with the Greeks not only during that decade, but also in the following years. We shouldn't forget that the Greek Revolution started in the Nubian principalities. A 3rd chapter offers a clear picture of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and the last chapter examines the politicization of the Greeks of the diaspora and their role during the war and after it. The second section contains 3 chapters which discuss the way the Greeks had been organized in the pre-war years and how that prepared them for the uprising itself and the political organization of Greece as an independent state. They examine the Greek communities in their local varieties and their role before and during the struggle, and the resistant groups, the Armatolian clefts, and how these 2 factors contributed first to the Greek uprising of 1770 and particularly to the revolution of 1821. The 3rd essay presents the most important factor, the one that actually allowed the War of Independence to take place, the secret societies. The essay starts with Rigas Melestinlis, his revolutionary ideas and his plans, and then refers to other less well-known secret societies. The Filiki Eteria, the Society of Friends, receives, of course, the main focus. The 3rd section comprises the main events of the revolution in their respective regions. They are divided into 15 geographical areas, which correspond to an equal number of chapters: Constantinople and Thrace, the Aegean Islands, Asia Minor, Athens, Chios, Macedonia, the Morea, Rumeli, Chios, Samos, Crete, Cyprus, the Ionian Islands, and finally, Messaloniki and Navarino, due to their particular significance for the revolution. 6 chapters in the following section present those who played an important role in the struggle. They are organized in groups: the clergymen, the political leaders, the military leaders, the diplomats, the intellectuals, and finally the women, that is, 1/2 of the Greek population. The contribution of some individuals in each group is, of course, discussed at some length and commented on critically. The 5th section is devoted to the institutions of the emerging new state during the decade of revolution. Each one is presented in a separate essay: the national assemblies and the constitutions which they introduced, the economies of the state, the church, education, and press. Most of these were newly established, and those who came from the pre-war years were reorganized as much as possible under the circumstances. The effort to establish a modern Greek state in the midst of the havoc and the bloodshed of the war is one of the most important aspects of the revolution, since new progressive ideas and laws were introduced then, like that of a free state, human rights, the abolition of slavery, female education, etc. The ideas that deeply influenced the Greek War of Independence and the ways the events and the ideology were expressed in literary form, in the arts, and in popular culture present a new facet of the revolution, which is not often discussed in the general histories of the war of the Greek independence. In the critical dictionary, 4 essays are devoted to these. 2 more essays on the European and American philhellenism, such an important aspect during the war, conclude the book. The published papers are accompanied by specially designed maps and present clearly the geographical features and the toponyms. In the book, there are also carefully selected illustrations. Detailed indices help the readers find what they are really looking for in an easy way. I have not mentioned the names of the contributors to this volume, but I thought it would be tedious to mention a long list of 39 names of the authors. Some of them contributed more than one article in different chapters. I will only add that they are professors and scholars from various universities and research institutes and museums of Greece, Romania, and Serbia, and from the United States of America, the United Kingdom, and France. They are all well known for their academic work, especially on the subject of the Greek Revolution and the pre-revolutionary years. Although the volume covers such a wide range of aspects of the Greek War of Independence, it does not exhaust it and has never been the intention of its editors when they were preparing it. This work is not exhaustive, and it is obvious that this would not be realistically possible in just one volume. The Critical Dictionary of the Greek Revolution, however, provides the reader with the most recent fruits of the scholarship and on this important European event of the early 19th century. This is done in a concise but critical way. Despite the thematic grouping, the articles complement one another, and in the end, a clear general picture emerges. These well-researched papers introduce the readers not only to the necessary facts, but also allow them to proceed further and place this factual knowledge into a wider critical context so that their role and importance can be reappraised. Since I had been asked to say a few words as well on the paper concerning women, one of my two contributions to this book, I will try to present it briefly. I started researching the women of the Greek Revolution as a follow-up to my previous work on Greek women in the earlier centuries and up to 1821. Hopefully, my half-written book on this particular subject will be finished by the end of next year, incorporating a lot of new material from further research. The essay in this volume attempts to offer a general picture of Greek women's lives during the war, so it does not focus solely on their participation as fighters, though their contribution to the revolution in that aspect is also referred to. Contrary to what was usually common in past historiography, this chapter tries to provide some facts on how and to what extent the revolution changed or did not change women's lives. Local conditions made a great difference since each region was affected in a different way and for a longer or shorter period of time during the war. Class also contributed to the difference in their lives and fortunes, but not always and not everywhere. I tried to show that women suffered perhaps disproportionately during those years. Younger women and children comprised the largest part of the captives of the Turks and the Egyptians and were then sold as slaves. Older women were just killed. Only a limited number of those who were enslaved were eventually ransomed or exchanged. Women and children also comprised a very large part, and in some cases the largest, of the refugee population. Moreover, the consequences of the war on their living conditions, the lack of food and shelter, the outbreak of epidemics, etc., increased their mortality rate. That's why Capodistrias asked Procas von Osten to negotiate with Ibrahim Pasha the exchange of women of childbearing age rather than men with the Arab captives of the Greeks. Family life is also examined, and whether or not the laws of the new state affected it is also put into focus. Two new phenomena that made their appearance in Greece are also discussed as the introduction of education for girls and the establishment of schools for them that followed soon thereafter, as well as the appearance of a previously unknown laxity of in morals, even organized prostitution at the port of Patras are put in focus as well. Within the general issues that they are examined, the presence and the acts of some women stood out, the well-known figures of the War of Independence, and this, of course, I'll also discuss. Thank you very much. I hope I was not very tiresome.
Thank you. Not at all. I think it showed very well the range of topics covered in this monumental work. And for that reason, especially, we have the pleasure to have with us three experts on different aspects of what is covered by the book, and from whom we're very much looking forward to hear. The first is Professor Joanna Haenni, who's professor of classics at Brown, and who is an expert in Thucydides and has written extensively about that, but who is also an expert on modern Greek and very much involved in the Modern Greek Studies Association. Is the author of a book called The Classical Debt, Greek Antiquity in an Era of Austerity, right? So how images and of ancient Greece and narratives about ancient Greece still play out in politics today. And she recently translated the Archaeologist and Selected Sea Stories by Andreas Karkavitsas. So she's very much in this world between ancient and modern Greece, and hopefully she can say a few words about that, which is one of the central aspects of this particular volume. So, Joanna.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you so much. I will try to live up to that, though it might be in somewhat of an oblique way. So it's truly an honor and a privilege to have been asked to participate in today's event, a celebration of a major and indeed definitive English language reference work on the Greek Revolution. So, really in the first place, I do want to thank this book's editors, Professors Kitromilides and Tsoukalas, for their immense intellectual generosity in undertaking this volume, which from a logistical perspective, at least, I imagine was no easy feat. So as has been mentioned, there are nearly 50 contributions to the volume by an impressive and international range of scholars. And this beautifully presented book marks the result of an intellectual process whose complexities I can scarcely begin to fathom. The very format of the volume, as reflected in the table of contents alone, marks a contribution to the study of the Greek Revolution. The emphasis on contexts, and particularly transnational ones, on geographies and geographical variations, on various groups and classes of people and institutions, all of this marks a particularly inspired way of approaching such a complex body of material. And in particular, I love how section 6, Ideas and Creative Expression, strives to come to grips with the radical acts of imagination that both drove and were inspired by the revolution. And the final section, dedicated to resonances, suggests a much more elegant way of accounting for the impact of the revolution than the unsatisfyingly unidirectional term reception so often preferred by my own field. The notion of a critical dictionary is also itself ingenious, for the volume presents itself as a reference tool to facilitate further study, rather than as a magisterial last word. The judicious and programmatic choice of chapter titles, or really headwords of this dictionary, means that the entries represent both microcosms of and portals into the grander subject. These chapters are self-contained, but there's an interconnectedness and a synergy to them that imbues the volume with that somewhat paradoxical sense of comprehensive open-endedness that is the true hallmark of a dictionary. So I see the creation of this volume as an act of generosity, because in organizing and composing these essays, the editors and contributors have recast their own deep expertise to make its fruits comprehensible to a wider audience, and particularly to students. Even to touch upon the Greek Revolution in a course not wholly dedicated to the subject has been notoriously difficult. In English, there has been a lack of a serious yet accessible and concise set of overviews. So the appearance of this volume has now made it so much easier for we who are teachers to integrate material about the Greek Revolution into a wide variety of our own classes. And I'll just say that I know that I will be particularly glad to integrate Professor Kitromilides' chapter on the Enlightenment into a course that I regularly teach on writing about travel to and within Greece. Professor Kitromilides' account of the Greek Enlightenment as what he calls an expanding horizon throughout the Greek Mediterranean will serve as a sorely needed antidote to all these accounts of Euro-American travelers to Greece in the period who, in lamenting the putative ignorance of the Greek population, only revealed their own ignorance. So the virtues of this chapter, a lively and approachable distillation of a whole body of work by the world's leading expert on the subject. The virtues of his chapter are also the virtues of the volume as a whole. And of course, to be celebrated is the critical approach that was solicited by the editors. And here I do want to say, given the occasion and given the context, a few words about the case of the revolutionary figure with whom I happen to be most familiar, the American Philhellene Edward Everett. Nicolas, you're shaking your head as you knew I was going to talk about it. I think it's a particularly appropriate figure to mention in this setting for a number of reasons. One, it has to do with, of course, the fact that our gracious hosts are from the CHS, and the publisher of the volume that we're celebrating today is HUP. Everett's career began at Harvard, where he took all of his degrees and went on to become president, a post he truly despised, I might add. Another reason I think it's appropriate to mention him has to do with his status as a figure embroiled both in American activity around the Greek Revolution and in the work of remembering and commemorating the American War of Independence. Mm-hmm. And finally, Everett represents a figure around whom a more critical take of the kind exemplified this book, I think, remains to be desired. Everett was born in 1794 and became one of the most ardent and active American supporters of the Greek Revolution. He was the first American to publish an essay on modern Greek literature in an American periodical. He was the first professor of Greek literature as opposed to just language at Harvard, and he was the first American to receive a PhD. He was also an early American traveler to Greece, an acquaintance of Lord Byron, Korais, and by correspondence, Mavrokordatos, and he was the founder of the Boston Greek Committee. Amid all this, in 1825, Everett entered Congress as the newly elected representative from Massachusetts' Middlesex district. But in 1826, he gained a name and notoriety for himself when he delivered a 3-hour speech against a proposed amendment to the Constitution. He spoke in defense of the Three-Fifths Compromise and the American institution of slavery. And in doing so, he praised the ancient Greeks with having introduced, quote, domestic slavery, which delivered the free citizens from all the cares of gaining a livelihood, end quote, and allowed the leisured pursuit of the arts and sciences. When they learned of this speech, many of Everett's constituents and supporters in Massachusetts and beyond were horrified. The reputation of this rising political star was forever tarnished, and it's an oft-repeated refrain that, had Everett not given that speech in 1826, he would likely have gone on to be elected President of the United States. So I think Everett's commitment to Greek independence was rooted in far more than his personal politics, his dedication to Greek antiquity, and even his experience of travels in Greece and his friendships with key figures such as Byron and Korais. Everett had been just 5 years old when George Washington died at Mount Vernon in 1799. And even as a child, Everett had been deeply enamored with Washington's generation and the American revolutionary spirit of '76. He was always eager to surround himself with those who had shared in the struggle for American independence, and he actively sought out their company. As a young man in Boston, he came to know John Adams, and in the 1820s, he also struck up a correspondence with Thomas Jefferson on matters ranging from the issue of slavery to the publication of What But a New Ancient Greek Grammar. So in this particular setting, I'm really inspired by this volume by its approach to wonder how two of the United States' own most committed Philhellenes, Edward Everett and also Thomas Jefferson, reconciled their own Enlightenment principles and support for Greek liberation with defense of their own country's original sin of legalized and institutionalized slavery. And the contributions here in this wonderful volume by Roderick Beaton on Philhellenism and by Yannis Evrigenis on American Philhellenism urge us to pose these kinds of questions. They really do. And in particular, Evrigenis reminds us that, quote, the Greek Revolution was the embodiment of the struggle to defend Christianity from the Turk, who had so often played the role of Hannibal ad portas. In his chapter, he goes on to mention that, quote, American Philhellenism represents an excellent case study of the dynamics of American society that Tocqueville would soon thereafter describe so well. Tocqueville, that is, who angrily regarded slavery as a threat to the American Republic and a wound that would prove infinitely difficult to heal. So I think that these are the kinds of paradoxes that this volume is pushing me to rethink, and I am so grateful for it. In this regard, I've also found the contribution by Gonda Van Steen, a beautiful entry on anniversaries in the section on resonances, particularly illuminating. Van Steen there outlines how the 50th, 100th, and 150th anniversary celebrations of the outbreak of the Greek Revolution, quote, have come to represent the three different ways of celebrating statehood, even if those ways have had much in common. In each of those Jubilee years, she writes, quote, the celebrations and reenactments with their commemorative events and symbolic images acquired a prescriptive character, which further advanced their aim to educate youth in state-promoted nationalism, end quote. So I have learned so much from colleagues around the world who have worked so hard to ensure that this year's bicentennial commemorations have taken such a critical, reflexive, and reflective approach. Professors Kitromilides and Tsoukalas have given us a precious new tool for learning about the revolution, for teaching it to our students, and for fostering critical historical inquiry, both in this particular area and farther afield. Here in the US, we stand a mere half decade away from America's 250th, and I can only hope that the activity around that Jubilee year will be marked by the intellectual generosity and the critical commitments that are exemplified in this extraordinary new volume, The Greek Revolution, A Critical Dictionary. So thank you and congratulations, and kalotaxilo.
Thank you, Professor Haenni. Thank you very, very much for this. You mentioned, of course, but I mean, so many things. I'm just going to highlight one. You mentioned Tocqueville on slavery, and of course, Tocqueville is also a theorist of revolution, and that's very much at the heart of the project of this book. It's not a coincidence that it situates itself in the age of revolutions, also examined critically. For that reason, but not only for that reason, I'm very pleased to introduce our second panelist, Professor David Armitage, who's a professor at the Department of History and also the acting chair of the Committee on Degrees in Social Studies this year. I'm very happy to be part of that committee, and who is the author of many books on the ideological origins of the British Empire, Declaration of Independence, foundations of modern international thoughts, and also civil wars. And I'm mentioning civil wars, of course, because one of the ways in which the book starts is by highlighting the prevalence of civil wars in revolutions. And we know that civil war was a feature of the Greek Revolution too. So Professor Armitage, without further ado, the floor is yours, and we hope we can illuminate us in some aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for that enormously generous introduction, also for the chance to take part in this very distinguished panel. And of course, very great thanks to Paschalis, his co-editor, and the many distinguished authors of the Critical Dictionary of the Greek Revolution for the enormous gift of the book. I cannot outdo what Joanna has just said in pointing out the achievement of that book and how enormously not just useful, but also fertile it's going to be for multiple fields. But I did want in particular to turn the spotlight on its contribution to discussions of the age of revolutions. In this, I'm joined by the gentleman behind me, John Locke, who always Zoom bombs my calls, but it seems particularly appropriate that he should be here today because in some ways, as Paschalis, as a Locke scholar among his many other interests will know very well, was Locke in chapter 16 of his two treatises of government in 1689, 1690, who of course famously said, quotes, "Who doubts but the Grecian Christians, descendants of the ancient possessors of that country, may justly cast off the Turkish yoke, which they have so long groaned under whenever they have an opportunity to do it." Now, we might contest various historical aspects of his analysis there, but we could put that into a much longer sequence of ideas about revolution to see it at the very least as a premonition of the possibility of revolution in the area that we now know as Greece, and thereby to extend and expand our optic for thinking about the history of revolutions to include Greece itself. And I put it in those terms because, as has already been mentioned, particularly by Professor Tsoukalas, the Greek Revolution has proved very difficult to assimilate to most of the reigning models of the age of revolutions. Or I should put that more generously to say that most of the reigning models of the age of revolutions have not been flexible or accommodating enough to incorporate the Greek Revolution among the revolutions which are normally canonized, comprise a canon or a sequence or a set of revolutions to form that age of revolutions. In speaking of this, I'm partly repeating what Paschalis himself has said in the dazzling introductory essay to the volume, placing the Greek Revolution in broader context. But I did just want to highlight a couple of the ways in which the Greek Revolution has not figured up to this point in our narratives of the Age of Revolutions, in order, again, to accentuate the achievement of this extraordinary volume, and then also to lay the groundwork for a few questions or prompts about ways in which the volume itself might point towards new ways of incorporating the Greek Revolution into our considerations of revolution. So, as Paschalis discusses in that magisterial opening essay, perhaps the single classic treatment of the Age of Revolutions, at least in the Anglophone world, was R.R. Palmer's Age of the Democratic Revolution, published in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Notoriously, Palmer's volumes ended chronologically in 1800, most notoriously, of course, for failing to include the Haitian Revolution, but thereby necessarily also failing to include either the Spanish-American revolutions or, in relation to our topic today, the Greek Revolution as well. So chronologically, most of the reigning models of the Age of Revolutions, at least produced by Western historians or historians from the North Atlantic world, failed even chronologically to accommodate the Greek Revolution. Paschalis also mentions the equally influential but non-contiguous model of the Age of Revolutions produced by the late great British historian Eric Hobsbawm, who talked about the double crater of the Age of Revolutions, that is, the double crater of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. His model thereby not only excluded even the American Revolution from the Age of Revolutions, but because of its stress in particular on the Industrial Revolution, did not accommodate the Greek Revolution or large parts of Southern Europe, on which, of course, Hobsbawm himself was a notable and great expert. Even the most recent and most expansive models of an Age of Revolutions, expansive in time and especially in space, and I'm thinking here of the work of John Darwin and in particular of the late great Chris Bailey, each of whom have spoken in different ways about a world crisis spanning the period from roughly 1760 to 1840, even though their chronologies and their geographies indeed temporally and spatially make it possible to include the Greek Revolution within a broader sense of an Age of Revolutions as a world crisis, even their extraordinarily expansive and impressive accounts say very little at all about the Greek Revolution, reduce it to something of a dot in a larger global set of narratives. So in almost every one of the major syntheses we have available to us from the 1950s up to the near present of the Age of Revolutions, and I include in this even the volume on the Age of Revolutions, which I co-edited with Sanjay Subramaniam some years ago, where we strongly tried to put the Age of Revolutions again into a global context. Even our volume did not have a chapter on Southern Europe or one that could contextualize the Greek Revolution. So mea culpa, or nostra culpa, I should say, in having failed to assimilate it there. This is just to say that it's enormously important not only to celebrate the bicentennial, not only to contribute to the sequence of anniversaries of the Greek Revolution with a volume of this scope and magnitude and magisterial depth, but it's enormously important for the rest of us, that is, those who are not specialists on the Greek Revolution, precisely to adjust our conceptions of the Age of Revolutions to incorporate the findings of the volume itself, and of course the enormous archipelago of Greek language scholarship in particular, which is now made available to Anglophone readers through the medium of this remarkable and timely book. One should also mention, and this is mentioned often in the course of the book itself, that until very recently, Greek historiography, like so many other national, indeed nationalist historiographies, had not expanded its horizons in order to place its primal, its fundamental revolution within comparative, cosmopolitan or global contexts as well. And one may hope, and I think some of the remarks that have already been made in this panel suggest that even scholarship in Greek itself on the Greek Revolution will now expand its horizons as a result of this volume, first in English and then, as we all hope, when it's translated into Greek as well. What I want to do in the remaining couple of minutes I have now is just to think about some of the ways in which the critical dictionary can provide a platform for further thinking, deepening our thinking and deepening the connections of our thinking about the Greek Revolution with a broader cosmopolitan and even global age of revolutions, to think about the ways in which we might use indeed some of the fruits of the most recent historical writing on the age of revolutions, that is writing from the last 5 years or so, even when there's been a great acceleration and diversification of work on this period, to open up new perspectives on the Greek Revolution, but also to bring the essays and the approaches within the dictionary itself into dialogue with these new currents. And I think of these as the 4 C's. So I'm going to talk very briefly for about 45 seconds each on 4 C's. The 4 C's I'm going to list are concepts, constitutions, charisma, and counter-revolution. Concepts, constitutions, charisma, and counter-revolution. First, concepts. Many years ago, in the 1980s indeed, the great German conceptual historian Reinhard Koselleck proposed the idea of what he called a Sattelzeit, that is a saddle time, roughly coinciding with what we think of as the age of revolutions, including the Industrial Revolution, as a moment across Europe initially in his conception of enormous acceleration, consolidation, diversification of concepts in relation to accelerating social, economic, and political change. Of course, even a volume as ambitious as the Critical Dictionary of the Greek Revolution cannot accommodate everything. And there are indeed chapters which deal with the cultural impact and some of the political impacts of the Greek Revolution. But I would think of a parallel here to the volume on the Greek Revolution. That is a series of volumes which have been produced by the Spanish conceptual historian Javier Fernandez Sebastian and his collaborators, which have examined precisely the utility of this concept of a conceptual saddle time, a period of great conceptual innovation and consolidation in relation to the Iberian world that is including both sides of the Atlantic in the same period of the Age of Revolutions, looking at the way in which central core political concepts of the period, such as the idea of the people or the nation, to take the most basic, were transformed in the crucible or the matrix of revolution in this period. And I'm simply curious to know what work may be going on in Greek, which those of us who do not read modern Greek, alas, are not yet privy to, which might bring the Greek Revolution into dialogue with now those generations of work on the French Revolution, and in particular the Iberian revolutions, for the conceptual changes and innovations, even around the idea of revolution itself. As one scholar of the period has said, the idea of revolution was revolutionized in this period. Conceptual change even happened around the revolutionary idea of revolution. The very idea of a revolutionary is invented in this period. What kind of conceptual change is happening as a result of and in the context of the Greek Revolution? Secondly, after concepts, constitutions. Here I'm thinking, just as a marker, of Linda Colley's remarkable recent book, The Gun, the Ship and the Pen, where she traces the global spread of constitutions and constitutionalism, attachment to constitutions, reverence for constitutions, from the middle of the 18th century, from Pascal Paoli's revolution in Corsica in the 1760s, all the way up to the early 20th century, with implications, of course, right up to our own time. She does not, by my recollection, treat the Greek Revolution, but I'd be interested to know more about the salience of, in particular, the conjunctions that she observes, that is, the conjunction of print and constitutions, and also of warfare, and in particular, challengingly, she notes the prominence and importance of naval warfare in the context of both the need for accelerating tax revenues and therefore the greater need for legitimacy and consent, and therefore the formation of constitutional compacts which empowered war-making, state-forming governments in a long age of revolutions, and certainly an even longer age of constitutions. How far would that model of print, constitutions and warfare fit the model of the Greek Revolution? Or would she, for instance, have to expand and extend her vision of constitutionalism, modern constitutionalism, in different ways if the Greek Revolution and its attachment to constitutionalism were incorporated into her models? Third, after concepts and constitutions, I think of charisma. Again, another Princeton historian who's recently published in this area, also putting forward what I think we would now think of as the Princeton model of the age of revolutions, beginning with Pascal Paoli's revolution in Corsica again, which seems to be the moment of modernity now until the Greek Revolution dictionary is assimilated. But Bell, in his recent book, Men on Horseback, talks about the importance of charismatic leaders and their populist followers in an age of democratic revolutions. It seems to the outsider that the Greek Revolution is anomalous here, that unlike the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Spanish-American revolutions, it doesn't produce a Toussaint Louverture, a Washington, a Miranda. Is that correct? If it is correct, why does charisma, itself of course a Greek word, not appear so centrally within the context of the Greek Revolution? Does that mean that Bell's model of charisma in the age of democratic revolutions needs to be revised? Or are we just looking in the wrong places for the wrong kinds of charisma? There may be other species of charisma which we can find in the context of the Greek Revolution. And then finally, I think most importantly, and most challengingly, for me at least, in thinking about the age of revolutions, is that it's indispensable, truly indispensable, to think about this period as also an age of counter-revolutions. Until relatively recently, of course, most scholars who've written about the age of revolutions have, we might say in the broadest sense, been sympathetic to the programs of the revolutions themselves, have seen them as liberatory, have seen them as way stations on the way forward to a more open, accommodating, egalitarian, and even democratic modernity. That meant that tendency, that attachment of scholars themselves to a particular vision of the promise of the age of revolutions meant that for the most part, they overlooked the resistance to revolution. On the one hand, what we might call anti-revolution, but more importantly, they missed the other side of revolution, revolution as counter-revolution. The counter-revolutions themselves became revolutionary movements and were often modeled on the revolutionary movements themselves, not again, anti-revolutionary movements necessarily, but revolutionary movements of a different kind. There is not a chapter, there are paragraphs and parts of chapters which might be construed in the dictionary of the Greek Revolution. There's not a chapter on the Greek counter-revolution itself, but I wonder what such a chapter might look like and whether that might be incorporated into a second edition of the volume itself, for instance. So those are just a few thoughts about the ways in which this book might point the way forward to new considerations of the age of revolutions, including the Greek Revolution, how we, that is those of us who study the age of revolutions outside the Greek context, might expand our horizons, and the ways in which this monumental book is monumental not in the sense of being a tombstone to a particular historiography or set of historiographies, but rather a signpost towards the future for further considerations of the Greek Revolution. I look forward to reconvening in whatever holographic technology we may all have in 50 years' time to talk about the 250th anniversary, to see just what the reception history of this volume has been, but I'm sure it will be great, diverse, and fertile, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in other fora, but with renewed congratulations to the editors and to the authors. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, David. And who knows, in 50 years, with the progress of technology, maybe we'll be here to discuss it.
Yes.
Thank you for these illuminating remarks. Last but certainly not least, Professor Mark Mazower, Professor of History at Columbia, and of course, a great expert on Greece, the Balkans, and Europe, author of numerous books such as Salonika, City of Ghosts, Dark Continent, German History, the Balkans, and then most importantly, I think for our panel today, I believe today, November 4th, is the day when Mark Mazower's book on the Greek Revolution, 1821, and the making of modern Europe is coming out. So I think you should be able to get it now. And we very much look forward to hearing Mark Mazower's comments on everything, really, the Greek Revolution itself, its significance for Europe, and for the world at large.
Thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be able to be with you to celebrate the critical dictionary of the Greek Revolution. And so just a few thoughts really to follow on what has been said. I think the first thing to say is congratulations, of course, are in order to the editors and to the publishers for producing the book that needed to be produced, which cannot be taken as a given these days. It is, first of all, it is long enough. It is not too short. It allows every contributor to go into the kind of detail that makes this a really useful book. It's beautifully produced. And I want to praise in particular, if you won't mind my saying so, Paschalis, the cartographers, because the quality of the maps in this book and the detail of the maps adds to the preciousness of this volume. Immense thought must have gone into this on your part and on the part of the cartographers. And I know what a skill that is and how important it is to make sure that a book like this has the adequate maps. And it's very unusual these days. And I want to say that the maps are as good as I've seen in any scholarly book lately. And I think for all of those reasons, this book will in fact achieve what you want it to achieve. I believe that it will make the history of modern Greece and the revolution in particular a recognizable subject to international scholarship. But I feel it will do something else as well. It will make international scholarship conscious of the tremendous vitality and range and fertility of history writing in Greece right now. I find it hard to think of another country where per capita the quality of historical research is as high as it is in Greece. And I think that's also a tribute to you and to Professor Tsoukalas, because you assembled a very remarkable a team of contributors. And I think it's remarkable, firstly, because it's very pluralistic in conception. You have people very different understandings, both of the event and of what history is. And so as a result, you get an appreciation for the full range of what is being done in historical research right now in Greece. And that's a precious thing to have in English. If you have, I'm just taking names at random, but if you have somebody like Dionysios Tsoukalas, whose work is superb example of historical sociology, I think, who's not terribly known in English. And now we have not one, but two contributions by him, and so on. And I could mention many, many, many others. So I think that you've given us this great range, and that got me thinking about something else that we should be really celebrating here. And I think it's fitting that this is around, in a sense, around Harvard and Harvard University Press. I mean, we're not only 200 years from the outbreak of the revolution, but we're 50 years from the 150th anniversary, which was the last time that there was a significant outpouring of commemorative scholarship. And I don't think it's too much to say that, in a sense, the generation of the inspirations behind this volume, that is to say, you, well, and Tsoukalas, perhaps an older generation, but nevertheless were shaped by the events of the junta, and by the experience of the junta, and by the fact that you, for instance, were in Harvard doing your PhD. And if one looks at what was produced in 1971, there's a wonderful bibliography on the Greek Revolution by year, and you can see that more things were published in 1971 by far than before or after. And it would be interesting to compare it with now. An enormous amount was published. Some of it was of pretty high quality, much of it was not. But it was hard to disentangle most of it from the junta's effort to wrap itself in the mantle of 1821. And I think the result of that was that it took Greek scholars a while to shake themselves off from the feeling that this was a subject of the right and that it was worth studying. And I think that one has to give credit, Paschalis, to you and to Professor Tsoukalas and to others of the generation that came in and reshaped the Greek universities in the Metapolitevsi after 1974, that laid the foundations for a completely unprecedented historiographical reckoning with the whole of modern Greek history. It became possible to study it professionally in a way that had not been possible in Greece before, because people were coming from Paris and they were coming from Boston and they were coming from Cambridge and they were coming from London. And that was the essential precondition, I think. Not that there weren't wonderful scholars, there were a few already in Greece working on this, but this completely transformed the landscape. So that what you've given us in this critical dictionary, in which in your very typically modest way you don't allude to, is the fruit of this half a century of institution building and professionalization of history. And so I think that in a way the book is if it's a monument to anything, it's a monument to where Greek historical scholarship is and where it's come over the last 50 years. So I appreciated it immensely. I just want to leave by throwing out a few questions for you and for others and for the discussion. The contributors to this volume span at least 4 generations. And so it would be idle to look for a single framing of this subject, even if you were to try to in a critical dictionary, which probably wouldn't be a very good idea. There is this notional framework of the age of revolutions. And then within that, there are many other competing alternative interpretations, I think. But I want to think about, if you'll forgive me, a few things that aren't in there as a preliminary to asking you perhaps to say something about the kind of structural choices that you made and the intellectual issues that confronted you and Professor Tsoukalas, and talk us through a little bit about your structuring of this volume, because let me give you a few examples, and this is not in the spirit of criticism, it's the spirit of anticipating where things are going to go next, really. So we know, for instance, it's incredibly difficult to write a book on this subject and to give the Ottoman context its due weight, because we just don't have as yet a very significant body of scholarship on the Ottoman dimensions of 1821, and this is changing more or less by the minute. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, where you felt Mehmet Ali or an Ali Pasha should have fitted, what there was to do about those. We have the very concise and useful chapter by Kostas Kostis, my dear friend, on the economy. But I think David Armitage was talking about taxation. One could imagine a different approach that gave much more weight to tax raising, or what presented itself as tax raising in the revolution. And a third area that would be interesting to hear you think about would be popular religion, miracles, prophets, a religious conception of what happened, which is not impossible to reconcile with a kind of post-Palmer modernity, age of revolution as triumph of enlightenment view, but it's not easy to reconcile it either. And so I, for one, when we get into the discussion, would be very interested to hear from you something about the kinds of discussions you and Professor Tsoukalas were having initially about what you wanted this to look like, and what you think it might look like in 10 years' time, how it might differ if you were to do another edition. I'm sure the last thing on your mind, but as a guide to how you see the field changing. Thank you. Thank you for the book. It's a really magnificent achievement.
Thank you. We have little time and many questions on the table already. I'm not going to add much other than reading one question that's on the chat about whether the book discusses songs and song genre, music and dance associated with, in some fashion, with the struggle for Greek independence. And then also highlighting a few things, such as, for instance, the Age of Revolution. Maybe it might make sense for one of the contributors to clarify in what sense the Greek Revolution is a revolution. What exactly do we mean? And also going back to what Mark Mazower said about popular religion, in what sense, as Joanna mentioned before, is the Greek Revolution a defense of Christianity, or is it more complicated? And last, broader question, perhaps, as we are being watched by a broader American academic public, what is the significance of the Greek Revolution and the formation of the Greek state for an American public who has a broad interest in understanding the world today and moderate interest in Greece? What's the takeaway? What's the most important thing? So with that, I'd like to ask anyone who would like to answer.
Well,
and if not, I think Paschalis, everyone is watching you.
Let's be practical and realistic. All the issues that have been raised would require another seminar to handle. But if there are any more questions coming in from the participants, perhaps we can take those into, and then I try to provide not answers, but some hints.
If you want one more, is the spirit of Philiki Eteria still alive in contemporary Greece?
Well, we had a good chapter on Philiki Eteria in the book.
Exactly.
I don't know about the spirit of Philiki Eteria. Philiki Eteria belonged to the movement of secret societies of the period of reaction, actually, following the French Revolution. And now we live in a much more open and pluralistic world. So you can do things in the open rather than needing secret societies to promote causes of political and social change. But let me just take up very briefly, because I see the time is very limited. Mark has posed some important issues, and of which one is really very appealing and interesting to me, the issue of popular religion. We do have a chapter on popular culture, which has collected significant evidence from different sort of sources of expression of popular culture. And we have one chapter on religion and the church and how religious feeling motivated the participation of the peasant masses in the revolution. Therefore, we, in a way, have approached that from different angles, although from the very beginning, the idea which Tsoukalas and I were discussing in response to Mark's question was that if we want to get this project done, we have to be realistic and we cannot cover everything. So what we wanted to do was to provide a basic, not structure, but infrastructure for people who would be interested in first familiarizing themselves with the whole range of events and phenomena making up the Greek Revolution, which was not just a temporary explosion, but it lasted more than 10 years. if you think that already in the winter of 2020 things were on the move, and then in the spring of 2021, in the spring of 1821, you had the various outbreaks at, as a matter of fact, all over the Greek peninsula, not just in the Morea or in Roumeli or in the islands, in the north, in Macedonia, and of course, in Crete in the south. So to cover all of that and to motivate people to study it, we had to provide in a way anchorages in which scholars and readers might find a point of departure for further reading and research. That was the aspiration. How much of that we have achieved is up to you and to the readers of the book to judge. And then I think Joanna mentioned the question of logistics, that's of bringing all of this together and managing scholars. And as you know, Greeks are not very good in meeting deadlines. So I had to agonize throughout the spring of 2019 in collecting the chapters. And some, I must perhaps confess now that a couple of very important chapters were never written. So we had to live with that, and the relevant material to sort of have it appear in other chapters in order not to be absent from the overall collection. So we had to cope with all of this. And of course, I kept realizing that we are missing this and we don't have that. But then I sort of kept telling myself, you have to be a realist and you have to aim at having a coherent result. And I think at least we achieved that. A lot remains to be done. Some of that we achieved, we sort of aimed at somehow raising and addressing in the collection we produced at the conference we convoked at the University of Athens, which meant earlier this year, and we just managed to have the book published. Reappraisals and comparisons of the Greek Revolution and the Age of Revolution. So some of the questions that Mark has raised are addressed there. In a very interesting chapter, for instance, on policing during the Greek Revolution. But I want to, in the sort of 5 minutes I see we have, I want to come back on one of the issues raised by David, which is the question of charisma. Who was charismatic in the Greek Revolution? Who was charismatic? Because certainly the military leaders. We didn't really have a great civilian leader who possessed that kind of appeal to the masses. But if we look for charisma, we can find it primarily in the person of Theodore Kolokotronis, who was a great military leader who actually kept the revolution alive in the period of the Turco-Egyptian invasion of the Peloponnese. So it was Kolokotronis' appeal to the people that managed to, in a way, preserve some points of resistance in the population and in the countryside to keep the revolution alive. And we can find other cases of resistance also. but I think mostly Kolokotronis, who also, as we are informed by the chapter on popular culture, was also a composer of folk songs, celebrated the spirit of the revolution and especially the spirit of self-sacrifice. So it's there, you have to look for it, and then you have to think of what more can be collected to fill in the picture. And finally, the question of counter-revolution. That is very important. And we don't really have, in the Greek case, the kind of counter-revolutionary thinking, expression, but also action we have in the paradigmatic case of France. In the American Revolution, you have expressions of counter-revolution. In France, par excellence. In Greece, in a way, the articulation of an assertive counter-revolutionary thought and action was preempted by the cooptation of conservative elements like the church into the whole struggle for liberation. So from that direction, you don't have a serious counter-revolutionary expression, although you have repeated appeals emanating from Constantinople to revolutionary Greece to resubmit to Ottoman rule. But that never grew into a kind of consistent and coherent argumentation. Of course, later on in the 19th century, you have some cases of thinkers writing critically about the revolution, but that cannot be taken as a significant form of counter-revolutionary theoretical argument or a proposal for an alternative path for the development of the country. And it is in this regard that nationalism as an integrating force has been so successful to the point of making Greece into what I have once described a paradigm nation, that it unified a social universe of considerable diversity into a national community. So these are some of the issues that may come up from the material discussed in the critical dictionary. And I assure you that nobody is better aware than I am of what is missing, of what is lacking, of what is lacking, and of what is not as good as I had wished it to be. But then we have some very important and excellent contributions in the book, like the chapter on women by Eleni, whose actually original inception came up in my exploratory correspondence with David Armitage. It was David who suggested that we should have a chapter on women, and Eleni made that possible.
So I wish we had, as Professor Kitromilides said, a few more hours to do a few more seminars. We are running out of time, so we have to say goodbye. I want to thank you all very much for all these contributions. Highlight again that one of the richnesses of this book is that it touches on so many aspects that are not typically discussed when we talked about the Greek Revolution. The women is one of them. Popular culture is another. I wish we could have time to discuss all of them. I want to thank you all very much. This session has been recorded. So if you came late or if you didn't have the chance to watch it all, it's going to be available online. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.